a dowry into her marriage, that dowry automatically shifted to the husband. So if there was a divorce or if someone died, the woman would not have any property or any funds to support herself. So that was one reason. The second reason was, hey, look, this is our country too. Since the 1830s, most states in America had dropped the property qualification for being eligible to vote, which meant that you did not have to own property to vote in an election. And the women at Seneca Falls and their male allies, and you can see from this picture that there were men at this grouping, they believed that the political process would become more fair, less and less contentious if women were allowed to vote. Now, keep in mind, in 1848, this was a very divided country. The US was a very divided country. You had the slave states and you had the free states. And they were becoming increasingly antagonistic to each other to the point where just 13 years later, the nation erupted in a civil war over the institution of slavery. So women wanted a voice, and they believed that they could cool things down, that they could address the situation with less confrontation than men could. Next slide, please. Now, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, many presidents were married. In fact, most, except for one, James Buchanan, in the 1850s. And the wives played a very background role, except for Abigail Adams, as we have noted. But that changed with the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was president of the United States from 1932 to 1945. And his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, and you see her here in the middle of this photograph, broke a lot of precedents as First Lady. For one thing, she actively campaigned with her husband. In part, that was necessary because Franklin D. Roosevelt had been stricken with polio and he was paralyzed from the waist down. So his mobility was limited. But of course, Eleanor, as you could see here, is not limited by that. And she participated in his various political campaigns in the 1930s and early 1940s. Not only that, but she was a wonderful speaker, and she believed that if she could generate enthusiasm, particularly among women, that they would come out to vote. Now, with women's suffrage in 1920, which allowed women the right to vote, most political observers said, oh, well, what's going to happen is that women will just vote like their husbands. That's the way it goes. And sure enough, through most of the 1920s, that's exactly what happened. But Eleanor Roosevelt wanted to change that. She believed that there were certain issues that were particularly important to women's issues, particularly those related to education, particularly those related to children, and particularly related to the balance between men and women in marriage. And she became very popular, particularly among women. and drew record numbers to vote. And of course, they voted for her husband, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Next slide, please. Now, women had a lot to overcome. It wasn't only the fact that they were cut out of politics for so long, at least until the 1920s. It was the expectations. Here we have a typical American family before the Civil War, a husband and wife and children. Women, particularly middle class women, were expected to stay at home. Working? Oh, no, no, no. Could not work outside the home because that would take the woman away from raising the children. And that was the number one role of women, raising children. Secondly, maintaining the house, being a housekeeper. And third, supporting the husband in whatever he might be doing. So this was the perception, at least until the 1920s. Next slide, please. The perception began to change even before the 1920s, as early as the 1850s. And this young woman was largely responsible for that. Her name is Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she wrote a best-selling novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which exposed the trials of slavery, which exposed how damaging it was not only to the slave, but also to the master and to whites and blacks generally in the United States. And it was very unusual for a woman writer, and then there were many women writers in 19th century America. It was very unusual for a woman writer to focus on a main political issue because women were out of politics. Politics is dirty. You don't want to get involved with that and language and things like that. But Harriet Beecher Stowe felt that the institution of slavery was so important to attack that she could not refrain from using her talents as a writer in a political way. And her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, played a key role in generating anti-slavery sentiment in the northern United States. Next slide, please. At the same time that Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, we were beginning our industrial revolution, the American Industrial Revolution. And one of the earliest industries in that revolution was the textile industry, making clothes, making towels, making bedding, bed sheets, and the machinery for making these items required dexterity, required small hands that could fit in the machines. And of course, women and girls were most likely to have that in their literally in their hands. Next slide, please. Now, during the American Civil War, when over 750,000 young men were killed, The nursing profession up until the 1860s was predominantly male. That is, if you wanted to be a nurse, you were a man. You had to be a man. But because the men were off fighting, somebody had to be a nurse to the men who were wounded or injured during the Civil War. And here you see a nurse feeding feeding two wounded soldiers. One of the leaders in this movement was a woman called Clara Barton, and she founded an organization called the Red Cross during the Civil War. The idea behind the Red Cross was that she would recruit women to become nurses, and she would ask the civilian population to donate blood to save the lives of soldiers and contribute to their health. So the Civil War was really a turning point in expanding the employment opportunities for women. First, you had the textile industry before the war, and then you had the medical and nursing professions during the Civil War. Next slide, please. But there was a new invention after the Civil War. That invention was called the typewriter, and it was invented by an Italian gentleman by the name of Olivetti. And I remember very well my grandmother had an old Olivetti typewriter in her house. And it was a magnificent machine. It was the first typewriter in the world. And again, just as the idea that women were more dexterous than men, that is, they could do things with their fingers that men had trouble with. I'm sure we all realize that this is not physiologically accurate, but that was the medical idea at the time. So in order to operate the typewriters, and here you see these women, and of course you see the supervisor, always male, women operating typewriters because they had the dexterity, they had the types of fingers that were crucial to operating a typewriter correctly. The other thing was that in the late 19th century, when this photograph was taken, women actually were more educated than men. Men often went to work before they finished high school, but women, because of limited job opportunities, went to high school and finished high school, and even on occasion went out to college. Next slide, please. In the late 19th century, we not only had the typewriter revolution, but we had the Industrial Revolution and the development of mass furniture, clothing, and other items for the growing middle class of America. And there was a new shop in town, and that shop was called the department store. And here we're looking at Marshall Field's department store in Chicago. And shopping was something that men and women did in the 19th century. But the owners of the big department stores believed that women really controlled the taste of fashion, controlled the taste of what was happening inside the home in terms of furnishings. And so they oriented their department store toward women. And more often now, after the turn of the 20th century, women became the main shopping clients for the department stores. Next slide, please. So while women were gaining in work, and while women were gaining in the consumer industry, there was one thing women did not gain, and that was the right to vote. And here you have a cartoon from 1913, and you see this woman putting up her laundry, because of course women did the laundry. And who is that woman? Well, if you can see here, this is Mother America. And what she wants most of all is universal suffrage. In other words, the right to vote. So beginning in the late 19th century and accelerating and expanding in the early decades of the 20th century, there was a movement to expand the suffrage to include women. And in 1913, when President Woodrow Wilson took office, the Democratic Party, as opposed to the Republican Party, the Democratic Party thought, well, if we're going to maintain the majority, we're going to have to push for the right of women to vote. And of course, that happened, and the amendment to the Constitution enabled women the right to vote. Next slide, please. Well, at the same time women achieved the right to vote, they also achieved the right to join labor unions. And my grandmother was a member of this labor union that you're looking at right now. It was the International Lady Garment Workers Union, the ILGWU. And the members of the union made clothing. They worked in textiles. And you can see the young women, and some of them were actually girls. This is abolish slavery. And this is some Hebrew lettering, because many of the girls who worked in the textile mills were Russian Jewish and Italian immigrant girls. And so the predominant language in these textile mills was not only English, but it was also Yiddish, which is a combination of German and Hebrew, and Italian. And the unions were instrumental not only in organizing these girls, but also in improving the quality of life of the workers. Next slide, please. Now, during the 1930s, as I mentioned earlier, Eleanor Roosevelt attempted to expand women's suffrage, and she did a pretty good job of that. When World War II came about, same thing as in the Civil War, the men went off to fight, and the women, for the most part, stayed at home. But there was a big difference between the Civil War era and the 1940s, in that women had advanced significantly, particularly as a result of the right to vote. And you see this poster here and these hats. These are hats of women in the armed forces, women in the Navy, women in the Army, and above all, women making munitions, women making shells, women building airplanes. Uh, so the idea here was, okay, our men are all fighting. They're not going to be working in factories. We have to recruit women. And this was a tremendous breakthrough because aside from textiles, women did not work with heavy equipment particularly in factories uh, that made materials for war. Next slide, please. But the war ended, thankfully, and many Americans were concerned that, hey, women are getting the idea that they can go out and get a job and work and improve their incomes and go to school, go to university, because the universities had lost almost all of their men, so they recruited women. Uh, but after the war, many said, hey, wait, these women have to come back into the kitchen. These women have to come back home. And so you get pictures in magazines like this. This woman with her apron and a sink full of dishes that she's drying. Next slide, please. Now, manufacturers of kitchen equipment like stoves and refrigerators, for example, ovens, uh, they always used women in the kitchen. Now, this woman, it's kind of funny in a way because I don't know any woman who would be cooking in a dressy dress and high heels. But the idea was that the kitchen is the woman's domain, and especially if you have children, as obviously she did. And she's teaching her daughter, look, this is what I made for your little brother. And this is what you're going to sew, you're going to cook, you're going to maintain the home. This was widespread in the 1950s because the idea was that, hey, women have to get back to the kitchen. The war's over, and let's get back to where we were. Next slide, please. Um, if we could move that slide up just a little bit so you could see the entire picture. There we go. Now, this was the Saturday Evening Post, which was one of the most popular magazines in America in the 1950s. This particular issue was in September of 1959. And you can see here a woman at her desk. She's working, she's at work. That's pretty obvious. She's at work. And what is she thinking about? She's thinking about being home with her husband and in the kitchen, obviously, uh, washing the dishes. And it's an ironic cover because she's wondering, am I doing the right thing? Am can I work at a job outside the home and yet be a good wife to my husband and mother to my children? Uh, and this cover demonstrates the increasing pressure by women to break out of the confinement that they had been in since the end of the Second World War, but yet there were feelings of guilt. I should be home. Maybe I should be home. On the other hand, I'm making money so that we can have a better life. So um, it was a dilemma. Next slide, please. It was a dilemma until 1962. That's when Betty Friedan, whom you uh, see here, wrote the book, The Feminine Mystique. And she articulated this conflict that I've just spoken about. The idea, well, I want to fulfill my talents and I want to work outside the home. I want to bring in money for my family, yet at the same time, I don't want to neglect my family. And essentially, what Betty Friedan said here in The Feminine Mystique, you can have it all. You can do it all, especially if you have the support of your husband. And The Feminine Mystique uh, obviously became a bestseller. As you can see here in this edition, there were already 1.5 million copies in print. And not only were people reading the book, but they were joining organizations like the National Organization of Women. And what Betty Friedan did, not only did she articulate this dilemma, but she also encouraged the visibility of other women in fields that were not directly associated with women. Next slide, please. Um, the civil rights movement. This is Rosa Parks, and she was arrested because she dared to sit in the white section of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, a southern state where segregation was the rule, was the law. And it's interesting when when Americans talk about the civil rights movement, oh, it's Martin Luther King Jr. Um, yeah, it is Martin Luther King Jr. But the fact was that many of the key moments in the civil rights movement were initiated by Black women. And that's an important point to keep in mind, particularly today. Next slide, please. I mentioned that women, particularly in professions that were dominantly male, were often invisible. This changed again in the 1960s with Rachel Carson, whom you see here. Rachel Carson was a biologist for the government, for the federal government. She was brilliant, but she could not find a job in the private sector because a woman biologist, that just doesn't make any sense. A woman biologist with a master's degree? Oh, no, no, there's something wrong with her. Um, well, Rachel Carson, what Rachel Carson did uh, was to look at fields and ponds and rivers and see what was happening to our natural environment and connecting that to what was happening to our food supply. And she put her findings together in a book called Silent Spring, because spring, she felt, would become silent because all the birds would die, eating the trees and the bushes and the fruit that were sprayed with chemicals. And Rachel Carson really accelerated the environmental movement. Next slide. This is one of the most forgotten yet important women in American history. Her name is Martha Griffith, and she was a congresswoman from Michigan, the state of Michigan, the United States Congress. And in 1964, finally, the US Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which demanded equality, an end to discrimination against Black Americans. And Martha Griffith said, hey, wait a second. What about ending discrimination against women Americans? And everybody, oh no, let's take care of this racial issue first, and then somewhere down the road we'll address that. No, she insisted, and finally got the measure into the 1964 Civil Rights Act of gender equality. Yeah, we had racial equality in that 64 Civil Rights Act, but women were not part of it until Martha Griffith put them in. Next slide, please. Now, in the 1970s and 1980s, women took advantage of these laws and not only entered the workforce in record numbers, but also demanded that they would have equal salaries. I mean, if you were a corporate executive and you were a woman, why shouldn't you make as much as the gentlemen who had a similar position? And as you can see here, by 1980, women were making 65% of what men were making. By the 21st century, that had gone up to 82%, but it has stalled. It has stalled. In other words, it hasn't increased significantly. In some lines of work, it has, but overall, it's been stalled. Next slide, please. Now, this has become an important issue in the presidential campaign. Almost every place in the world has paid maternal leave. My daughter-in-law is very fortunate. She works for a French company, so she gets paid maternal leave. But if she worked for an American company, forget it. So this is something that the federal government can step in. Now, some women who work for large corporations have this paid maternal leave, but it's only for to 8 weeks um, in some cases. Uh, my daughter-in-law, working for the French company, has had 6 months, but that's normal in France. It's normal in most other countries in the world. So this is really an area where the US does not resemble the advances of the rest of the world. Next slide, please. Now, beginning in the second decade of the 21st century, around 2013, 2014, and increasing since then, the women's rights movement has been resurrected. I say resurrected because the push uh, for women's rights leveled off in the 1980s with the rejection of the Equal Rights Amendment, or the inability of extra states to support the amendment to the Constitution. But now you have this Me Too movement, which generated as a result of sexual harassment in the workplace. And we have a presidential candidate in our current presidential campaign who was one of the targets of this particular movement. And it's still very active. Next slide, please. One of the more interesting things over the past decade um, is that most say those who commit sexual harassment or sexual assault at work are now more likely to be held responsible. The meaning of this is that the Me Too movement is paying dividends, that bosses cannot say things or do things to women in exchange for promotions or a higher salary. In other words, sexual harassment or assault uh, more likely to be reported now than they were. Next slide, please. The Dobbs decision in 2022 by the US Supreme Court, which struck down Roe versus Wade, a decision in 1973 that enabled women to get an abortion if they needed or wanted one up to a certain point in their term. And this has become a big, big issue. It was a big issue in 2022 in the off-year congressional elections, and it is a big issue in this coming presidential election. And it is a big issue, especially among suburban women who come out to vote, who believe that banning abortion is an intrusion into their personal bodies. And particularly, some states have not only made it difficult to obtain an abortion, but even under medical circumstances, even under rape circumstances, it has been outlawed. So that is really still a crucial issue in America today, and it will generate a significant number of women to come out and vote. And why is that important? Let's go to the next slide. Okay, women are more likely than men to hold at least a bachelor's degree. As I mentioned, more women going to college. Let's go to the next slide. Look at the registered voters, and you will see that there are more women registered voters. The women are in the dark stripe, and men are in the gray. There are more women voters than men voters. This has been the case for the past 40 years or so. The last figure we have is from 2022, the off-year elections, but it will definitely be the case in this coming election. And well, why is that important? Well, there is something called a gender gap. When I say gender gap, what I mean is that women tend to vote more for the Democratic Party than for the Republican Party, mainly because abortion rights, among other issues. So this is an advantage for the Democratic Party. Next slide, please. And you can see it here. This is the gender divide. This is the biggest gender divide in American history. Men support Kamala Harris, the Democratic presidential nominee, 40%. Women, 58%. That's 18 percentage points. That is immense. Immense. And it's even a wider gap between men and women as far as Donald Trump, the Republican Party candidate, is concerned. And that's why the emphasis has been, in recent weeks at least, to get out the vote for women as much as possible in the Kamala Harris camp because of this divide. This would be the greatest divide in American history between men and women. Next slide, please. What issue is the most important in deciding your vote this November, the presidential vote? Well, the economy is always the top issue. But look at abortion. For men, abortion doesn't exist. I mean, well, for obvious reasons, but it's not really an issue. But for women, it's the second most important issue next to the economy. Next slide, please. How supporters of the candidates say their policies would impact women and men. And the yellow slide says would make things better. And as you can see here, the Trump and Harris supporters have a diametrically opposed perception of this. Because men feel that Harris supporters would make things worse. Next slide, please. Well, as we said, there's a wide gap between Trump and Harris supporters on gender issues. Next slide, please. Women make up now more than a quarter of the 118th U.S. Congress membership. And you can see how dramatic this increase has been over the years, since the first time women got the right to vote in 1920 to the last time this was taken. So women are a significant political group in the United States. And who is going to benefit most from that in the November election? Next slide, please. Well, obviously, Kamala Harris. I can tell you when Joe Biden was running for president, uh, he got the women's vote as well, but the gap has increased with Kamala Harris. So the 2024 presidential election in the US will have significant ramifications for women. And if you believe that suburban women in particular, suburban white women in particular, hold the key to this election, then the ideas and ideals of Kamala Harris would probably prevail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. So I think that now it's time for questions.
Sure.
We have questions in chat. Could you check it, please?
Okay.
And then, guys, you can turn on your mics and ask Professor with your voice. Okay.
Okay. I see here. What is the wage gap in the U.S.? The wage it really depends on the job. If you're talking about so-called white-collar professional differences, women today make about 94% of what men make. In other words, it has improved significantly. In some other jobs, it's in the 80 percentiles. But it has been changing, mainly because our population growth has not kept up with our employment growth. So women are more valuable now as workers. Okay. What are the main barriers women face today when participating in politics? Well, it depends on what party they go into. In the Democratic Party, there are really no barriers. In the Republican Party, there are many fewer barriers than there used to be. So the most important barrier is fundraising. And the Republican Party in particular has they have a fundraising, the oil companies, for example, they have mostly supported male candidates, but at the same time, that is changing. So I think in terms of running for office, the bottom line, that is the revenue that you need to run advertisements, to run a campaign, to be on television, is becoming more equalized by gender. How do you think how you think while all women rights look like back to the past? Yes, voices women have, but many parts are still. Um, I think that we still have work to do. there's no question that we still have work to do. We have work to do in income equality. We have work to do in employment equality. I think we're doing an excellent job in terms of educational equality. We have a lot of work to do in terms of childcare. And that map I showed you all indicated that the U.S. does not do a good job of childcare, which affects the ability of women to get out of the home and to take a job out of the home. So that is definitely something that we need to work on. Right now, almost all Western countries' birth rates have plummeted below replacement rates. Why, with no major wars and the richest time to be alive, women don't want to have kids? Well, it's not only women who don't want to have kids, it's some men as well. And there are many reasons for that. Reason number one, kids are expensive. Reason number two, some parents, some men and women are wondering, do I really want to bring someone into the world in which we're living in right now, with environmental disasters, with wars all over the place? Now, the U.S. birth rate would be declining were it not for immigration. So we're pretty much in the same boat as Europeans are. But I think that it's a reflection of environmental issues. It's a reflection of economic issues more than anything else in terms of having women have children. And I believe that men feel the same way. And also, what we've had wide access to birth control, and that has had an impact as well. Okay, let me see here. Where can you find? Where can we find more of your content? Do you have a YouTube? Well, I wish I had a YouTube channel. That's a great idea.
But Professor, I put the link on YouTube channel of American Center Minsk where we
wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. In addition to that link, you could look at a recent book I published called The Gifted Generation. And it deals with many of the issues that I talked about this evening.